We've been discussing the problem of abortion as it relates to what we've called ectogenesis. So, the basic idea, just remember that it looks like, given the possibility of this future technology that we're calling ectogenesis, well, it looks like we could remove a fetus from the mother's womb without killing the fetus and without violating the woman's right to autonomy. And so let's remind ourselves that there were sort of three general objections that could be offered that was supposed to show that a woman might still have a right to the death of the fetus, even when ectogenesis was possible. The first we considered in the last video, and that was that maybe the woman or the biological parents collectively, well, maybe there is still a right to the death of the fetus insofar as parents have a right to avoid parenthood, or at least that parents might have a right to avoid certain harms that might come about through the obligations that are acquired through being a parent. Now, in this video, we're going to discuss the claim that someone might have a right to genetic privacy, and it's based upon this right. If someone does have this sort of right, then it might be the case that an individual or perhaps the biological parents collectively, perhaps there is a right to the death of the fetus. So let's take a look at how this argument is supposed to go. The first premise just says people do have a right to genetic privacy. Now, that might seem intuitively true at first, but let's try to support why someone might think that this premise is true. The kind of reason that Rosnan gives in support of this first premise, and Rosnan does seem to think that this first premise just is true. The sort of reason that one might give is something like the following. So suppose you're asleep one night and there's a mad scientist that comes and collects some of your DNA while you're sleeping, and you don't know about it. So this mad scientist takes your genetic material and then creates a fetus out of it, a cloned fetus, presumably, and then gestates that fetus in an artificial womb. And once you wake up and you find out that this has happened, intuitively, it seems like you would be willing to say that your right to genetic privacy has been violated. At least that's the way in which Rosnan tries to support this first premise. Now, I don't want to say anything yet to criticize this point. I just want to make sure that it's clear that we understand the way the argument's supposed to work. So what the second premise says is that ectogenesis, this non-lethal form of ending a woman's pregnancy, well, that could violate the genetic privacy that the genetic parents have. And again, this is supposed to be supported by the kind of mad scientist thought experiment that Rosnan offers, for the same reasons that you might feel that your genetic privacy has been violated once you find out that the mad scientist has created a clone and gestated it in a artificial womb. Well, likewise, in the case of ectogenesis, you would presumably feel the same way. That seems to be this basic point that Rosnan is getting at here. So if Rosnan is right, if we have reason to accept these two premises, then it seems to follow that genetic parents would have a right to the death of the fetus in order to avoid the sort of harms that might come from the violation of one's genetic privacy, as we've been discussing with regard to these two premises. So that seems to be the basic argument. Now let's consider the way in which Matheson and Davis respond to this argument. Now, according to Matheson and Davis, there's actually two strategies involved with how we could show that this argument doesn't work. The first strategy would simply be to deny that there is any sort of a right to genetic privacy, to deny that such a right even exists in the first place. And the second strategy would be to grant that maybe some sort of right along these lines exists, but then to deny that it actually entails that there is a right to the death of the fetus. Now, for the first strategy, it looks like they want to ask, what exactly is it that we mean by a right to genetic privacy? Let's get clear by what that actually means. So on the one hand, it looks like we leave our genetic material around all the time. If I take a shower and some of my hair ends up on the shower floor, or, for example, when I scratch my arm, there's some dead skin cells that fall down. We leave behind our genetic material all the time. So does that mean that that when I scratch my arm or when I take a shower, I'm violating a right? That doesn't seem right. The mere fact that my genetic material might exist out there in the world well, that doesn't seem to be a violation of the right to genetic privacy. Instead, it seems like the right to genetic privacy, if it exists, cannot be that my genetic material doesn't exist out there in the world at all. But instead, it seems like it must mean something like, well, I have a right not to have my genetic material misused in some particular way. Maybe I have a right for my genetic material not to be used in a way that I would disapprove of, like clearly in the case that Rosalind describes, where the mad scientist uses my genetic material to create a clone. That seems problematic. Likewise, we might say that, I don't know, if I donate some of my bone marrow, or if I decide to participate in some kind of a scientific research, well, it seems like, at least intuitively speaking, then I have a right for my genetic material not to be misused, to be used in some scientific study that I didn't approve of or I didn't give consent to. That seems to be a more plausible way of understanding the right to genetic privacy. So it looks like on this first strategy, we ask, well, the right to genetic privacy could mean that my genetic material doesn't exist out there in the world at all, and that doesn't seem right. Or it might just mean that my right to genetic privacy should not be misused without my consent. So yeah, we can deny the first one. Mathis and Davis want to say that that doesn't seem plausible. But if what we're left with is just the claim that I have a right for my genetic material not to be misused, that's just another form of a right to not be discriminated against. So, for example, if somebody were to use my genetic material and then not allow me to have some certain insurance plan or to receive some particular medical procedure because of the genetic material that they collected, well, that seems to be a kind of discrimination against me. Or if somebody misuses my bone marrow and uses that genetic material in a study that I don't consent to, that seems to be a violation of another right, not a right to genetic privacy, but some other discriminatory kind of right. That seems to be the way in which Matheson and Davison are arguing with regard to this first strategy. Now let's take a look at what they say with regard to the second strategy. So on the second strategy, they are going to grant that there is a right for my genetic material not to be misused, but then to say that there are important limitations involved here. What they say about this right is that at best, what I have is a right for my entire genome not to be released and misused without my consent. And it looks like the reason why they think this is because it might be the case that there are other rights or other obligations that could exist, which would overrule my right to not have my genetic material misused. So let's take, for example, somebody has a sample of my bone marrow. And for whatever freak reason, my bone marrow could save just millions and millions and millions of people's lives. Well, it might be the case that I don't give consent for my bone marrow to be used to save millions of people's lives, yet you might think that that could be overruled just simply because of the sort of utilitarian calculation that's involved here. You know, who cares whether or not Christopher gave consent? We could literally save millions of people's lives. So you might think that sort of case would be a situation where my right to genetic privacy is overruled. I think that is the sort of limitation that Matheson and Davis have in mind here. And as far as I can tell, that seems to be the basic reason why they say that this sort of right would simply be a right that my entire genome not be released and misused without my consent. Maybe my bone marrow can be, but not my entire genome. In other words, the mad scientist can't go and create a clone of me. But that has problems too. You might think, well, hey, my sister or my brother shares a certain amount of my genetic material with me, and my grandparents share a certain amount of genetic material with me. So if my sister or my brother or my grandparents decided to go and do something with their genetic material, would that be a violation of my right to genetic privacy? And so since a child contains half of both parents' genetic material, then only in the case of a clone would this argument actually be successful. I think something along these lines is the basic point that Mathis and Davison are arguing for, but let's take a look at a quote that they offer in order to see exactly how they're trying to make this objection to the argument work. Here's their quote. "Why should we think that this threshold, the 50% threshold, is morally important? Is it twice as important as the 25% of the genetic material that each grandparent has? And what about the genetic overlap between siblings? It seems very implausible to think that when my biological sister releases her genetic information without my consent, that she has thereby violated my right to genetic privacy. Thus, a defense of the 50% threshold seems to be needed, right? We doubt that such a defense could be given that would not rely on special pleading. Now, this point seems to be really important for Matheson Davis. They think that a positive defense, a positive reason would need to be given, and we might ask whether or not Rossanen's appeal to a collective right is just a case of special pleading, or if he is able to give us a positive defense, a positive reason for thinking that kind of threshold has been met. So now let's consider in some detail what exactly Rossanen says on this point.